Hello and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. Today we are going to be talking about scenarios and basically a little bit of a retrospective on what they've done in Mists of Pandaria, then just one or two suggestions for fixing them up, and then finally, well, I'm just going to talk about what their place could be in Warlords of Draenor and where I think they should slot them in and just that kind of thing. So let's just get sort of headfirst jumped into the video with the Mists of Pandaria retrospective. So scenarios were added in the Mists expansion and they filled a rather strange void, but for the longest time, of course, it was only the normal scenario that was available because the heroic ones were only added in patch 5.3. They basically replaced normal mode dungeons in a way. However, since the heroic dungeons were basically as hard as a regular normal dungeon anyway, I suppose they were more pre-normals in a way if you think about it in terms of difficulty. Anyway, they did not do a great deal for me personally, at all, really. They were just easy to the point of being really dull, and honestly, they felt more like an annoying thing to slog through rather than anything else. At the time, I just found heroic dungeons to be a lot more fun, so once I did my first one or two scenarios, that was it. I never really touched them again. But in principle, though, I think they are an okay way to introduce people to group content and fill out one or two slots of bad questing gear. They're also very convenient since, it requires 3 people with no specific role or anything like that, and the queue is, of course, very quick. But there are definitely a lot of problems with them, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So then in patch 5.3 they brought in the heroic dungeons, and I actually found these to be really enjoyable, especially with the time trial mechanic. They also rewarded gear that was actually quite nice at the time, and there was a decent chunk of valor there as well. And then, of course, they were actually difficult enough to properly warrant communication and strategy, with the timed objectives also giving you a reason to push harder. I think the combination of all this meant that they the rewards you got from them were mostly justified, so I think that was a pretty cool way to do things, really. And then, of course, the mobs themselves were actually kind of challenging, and they did have a little bit of strategy, actually. I remember that, was it the ice one? Like, there was 1 or 2 mobs there, you didn't mess around with them, you actually had to follow the strategy, you couldn't stand in the crap, and it was actually nice to see that. What this meant is that the mobs were actually just challenging enough to make it feel like you were always trying to overcome something, rather than constantly progressing through a rather dull slog, if we're honest, really, when we talk about the normals. So, yeah, I think that worked out quite well. Then, of course, the timed rewards, they just offer something to people who really try, so it always gives you just something to encourage effort and skill, and that's very important in terms of how you socially engineer your player base. And I know that does sound extremely evil, but it's something that happens in every game. Player bases are socially engineered, and that's fine, I think a more healthy player base is one that values skill and that kind of thing, so by offering these little optional things to shoot for, that are of course more efficient, it's certainly a very good idea. Now, of course, this is something that heroics did, but normals didn't really do them at all. And, well, while we're sort of talking about things that weren't too great, let's just go full on and talk about the bad bits of scenarios. So, first of all, I'm just going to talk about the bad parts of normals. I think the difficulty was a massive issue. They offered absolutely no challenge at all. This meant that victory was a foregone conclusion. And that feeling just means that it turned into a waiting game that still required you to enter buttons. It kind of just felt more like a data entry job, honestly. Oh, it was just so dull. So that was a problem. And then, of course, there were many of them which just had you doing these really arbitrary and often annoying tasks that just took too long. I think these scenarios scenarios in general, are best when they are quick, and when they don't involve running around the place, clicking items, waiting for boats, waiting for NPCs, or just in general doing things that aren't really based in the core mechanics of World of Warcraft. I do understand that it is, of course, important to have elements like that. They're a little bit more different, but I think perhaps they just should have reined them in a little bit in a few regards. So that was definitely an issue, and I think that the combination of some of these annoying gimmicks mixed in with the fact that, honestly, there was no difficulty there, it just meant there was, dull and boring. So yeah, giant problem there with the normals. And then I think heroics actually were pretty good as standalone bits of content, but I still kind of wonder if they should be match-made or not. I totally get why they currently are non-match-made though, but perhaps they could allow players to match-make past a certain item level, and then just queue with a pre-made group at basically any item level. I think this would be a lot more inclusive, and honestly, they're not ultra hard when you think about it, so honestly, going in with 20 item levels below the recommended, as long as you're within a guild, could provide a very fun and very rewarding challenge for people who are just willing to put in that extra effort and really try to play their class well, I think that could work out kind of well. So perhaps that's something that's worth thinking about. It would be very curious to see how a change like that would pan out, though. And of course, I think they would need to ensure that heroic scenarios last beyond one patch in terms of gear. No extra heroic scenarios came out, which meant that they were basically rendered useless after a while, or near useless. Like, sure, some of their gear is still kind of useful at the minute, but in the grand scheme of things, they kind of faded away. But especially, like, if these are going to be there as a part of the first patch of Warlords of Draenor, or maybe at launch, then Blizzard will need a way to carry them forward with the expansion, so it would be interesting to see how they would do that. Now, I think that if we expect every single major patch in the game to have a raid tier, a few scenarios, and then maybe a few dungeons, well, I think the overhead of patches like that may be a little bit too much, and it could be to the detriment of some other bits of content, and I think we would all prioritize a raid over a heroic scenario. Still though, perhaps every, secondary, kind of like minor patch could have one or two new scenarios just to give people something to do. After all, they are actually very easy to make, and oddly enough, I think that players enjoy the non-gimmicky ones the most, and of course those non-gimmicky ones are probably the easiest to make because really it's just a case of making the terrain and doing the art for it, but of course those tile sets will already be they'll be finished, and then just doing some of the background like scripts and things for them. Yeah, it's still work, but perhaps it's less work than putting in like a full gimmick system and pathing special NPCs or making a new jetpack or something. So I think that would be a sustainable way to do it. Though of course the odd, well-placed gimmick is certainly a good break of pace if it is done well. I just don't think that they really managed to do it well in all cases. Alright then, so how do we improve these? Because sure, I have definitely highlighted a few problems. I've also highlighted one or two good things, but what we really all care about going forward is how they can make the game better and the kind of things that they can improve. So, well, my list is only 3 or 4 sort of points long, but I think there's 3 or 4 important points. Of course, if you have any other points yourself, be sure to leave them down in the comments, and I don't know, yeah, maybe it'll appear in a future video. It just depends what the response to this one is. Anyway, so, how do we improve them? Well, first of all, I think they should make the normals just a little bit harder so that there is constantly something to work through, rather than just sleep through, and still click buttons. Now, how could they do this? Well, first of all, you don't want to have things extremely hard in terms of raw damage output and raw healing. That means that you just want to have some very easy to understand mechanics that actually do something to your character. If there's maybe a conal attack that is very, very, very apparent, that takes 1 or 2 seconds to cast, well, at least that's going to force you to move your character and react to the enemy that you're fighting. Maybe it takes off half your health or something, but in general, nothing that can one-shot you, but also nothing that is 100% ridiculously trivial. If they have mechanics like this, then hopefully it should get people kind of geared up and ready. And of course, some people are going to say, well, these are just normal scenarios, they shouldn't be that hard. Well, okay, they're designed for people who don't have the best gear, but here's the thing. The people who do these normal scenarios will also be moving into dungeons, they might be doing LFR, they might even be doing flex. So I think it's totally reasonable to, just to put in some decent mechanics in there that can get you killed if you fail them. A little, too much. Nowhere near as hard as, say, a current heroic scenario, but still have mechanics in there that can legitimately cause a problem for players, because these people are going to have to deal with these mechanics in flexes and LFRs anyway. Also, of course, in LFR, there are plenty of people who still stand in the crap and things like that. Maybe if they had it kind of whipped into them not to from an earlier stage, then they wouldn't do that. Because, think about it, if you hit level 90 for the first time, it's your first time playing World of Warcraft, or maybe you haven't played in ages, you see some conal attack come from an enemy, and you stand in it, and you don't die, and you think, huh, well, that means I can probably get away with that in the future. Then when time goes on, and you're doing a bit of harder content, you still stand in the crap. It's a bit of a problem there. Bit of a problem. So I think that could possibly be, once again, another sort of social engineering-y way to get people to be a little bit better. So there's that, and then of course I would suggest less gimmicks, and really just please, Blizzard, less gimmicks. You have such a tendency of overdoing the gimmicks, and when they are overdone, which they often are, they just get in the way. Games work best when they introduce gameplay patterns, i.e. say your core class combat, and then they do interesting variations on that, where they get you to use your core abilities and skill set in varying manners to get, of course, positive rewards. That's good gameplay design there. Now, of course, course, throwing in one or two things sort of out of the blue can be fun, but when they constantly throw in new things that don't really fit within the core gameplay experience of the game, then it just doesn't work out. It feels like not a good break in pace that's interesting, but it just feels like, ugh, what is this? Now I have to read a bunch of tooltips, blah blah blah, and basically not fun. One of the nice things about the way that you should do it is that once people understand their core gameplay, then they can always have a new experience with new patterns that are thrown at them by the developer, but in a way that doesn't require them to do a great deal of extra learning. Just with gimmicks, you kind of need to, you know, they just feel kind of contrived as well, and I just don't think they're that great. So I think that the core thing that Blizzard should really just keep in mind is they should just remember that if a gimmick is not fun after the first time that you complete it, then it likely shouldn't be put into the game. Because a theme park MMO like World of Warcraft is something that is going to be, in a way, kind of based off repetition. Players are going to do the same dungeon multiple times, you're going to do the same scenario multiple times. So why put in mechanics that last once and then are boring? It's a bit of an issue, and honestly I think that some questing areas also suffered from this, especially Cataclysm and the Indiana Jones quests. So that's the thing. And then I think finally, one thing they should really emphasize is just be short and sweet. Short and sweet wins in this kind of content, and I think that we should never have to wait for an NPC or a timer or anything like that to be allowed to do something. And while the Monkey Island scenario was pretty cool the first time, the ultra-deterministic nature of the resource collection meant that it just got really dull after a while, especially after your first time. You just kind of knew, okay, well, I'm probably going to sit here for 10 minutes, and if the player who is at the ship, you know, messes up, then all the monkeys are just going to come and steal the brew anyway, and oh, it'll just be a pain. You don't want mechanics that are just actively a pain in the arse, really. So yeah, less deterministic things, but of course, don't make them all just pure combat. You need to spice it up here and there, but I think the best way to spice it up is by offering interesting enemies to fight, not by getting you to put out fires by clicking a button and doing 3 backflips and I don't know, 720. Okay, we haven't actually had to do that, but you know what I mean. You get my drift. It's just give us more fun enemies if you really want to kick things off and make them interesting and that kind of thing. Alright, so finally, to round off the video, I'm going to talk about what the place of scenarios should be in Warlords of Draenor. Now, this is a really important topic, because in Mists of Pandaria, scenarios basically replaced the role of dungeons in a way, especially the heroic scenarios. That was a little bit of a problem there. But I think the core thing is that both heroic scenarios and then dungeons are different kinds of content, so it is very unfortunate that they did take away from each other, but they don't necessarily have to. So what do I think they should do? Well, it's really hard to say without knowing the exact gearing and item levels for Warlords of Draenor, but from what I can gather, you should ideally be going into a normal dungeon and then straight into LFR raiding. That seems to be what they've said. Or then if you want to do full-on raiding, then you'll go from normal dungeons to heroic dungeons to the challenge mode daily quest dungeons and then into flex/normals. By the way, if you're not sure what these challenge mode daily dungeons things are, basically they're adding a daily quest to challenge modes, which will give you a piece of gear that's very good, and it should have roughly the difficulty of, say, one of those hypothetical mythic dungeons, while still fitting into the game's current framework and being completely disconnected from the time trial element of challenge mode. So I think that's very good. Anyway, so heroic scenarios should definitely, in my opinion, fill the gap between normal dungeons and heroic dungeons. If they balance the item levels if they balance those item levels correctly, then they really shouldn't cannibalize each other at all when you think about it. Hopefully that can happen. That said, are they going to put scenarios into Warlords of Draenor in much of an endgame capacity? Well, I don't really know what the expansion's going to pan out like, and I can't recall of much in the way of an official statement on the matter. I'm sure they will add some new ones, but we don't really know where they're going to fit, and I'd actually imagine that Blizzard has probably made the content, but they don't know where it's going to fit either. They probably still need to tune it and do that kind of thing. Anyway, so another thing to talk about is what they actually could be. So I think that there are going to be a lot of really cool things in this war with the Iron Horde, and they don't need to go all, spec ops with every single scenario. They've been very much like you're either a special agent doing something or you're doing some sort of heavily gimmicky style thing. Well, here's the thing. Parts of, there's always parts of battles and things like that that could be done via scenario. in World of Warcraft, sure, there are probably like giant battles that happen from time to time, and I think that a heroic scenario could just show off a little snippet of that battle in a pretty cool way that maybe takes 5 minutes, it's instantly readable, and you don't really need to know much about the lore just to think, hey cool, I'm in the middle of a big battle, that's fun. So hell, you could do something like holding a keep, or killing off a commander in a battle, or flanking some like important thing, or maybe, I don't know, just general, the stuff that could be done by the elite troops but in an actual battle. Because I think that would be really cool, and it's just one of those things that Blizzard have never really portrayed much within Warcraft. We've always been the people going in the side entrance, you know, in behind enemy lines, and that's cool, but I just think for fighting the Iron Horde, it would be really nice to just get in there. And you know what? All those really kind of badass feats of heroism that are only done by sneaking in the side entrance, killing a whole bunch of bosses, and doing some cool badassery, well, they can still be there for the heroic dungeons. But I think for scenarios, just a quick little readable thing, jump into a battle, kill the enemy commander, or do something like that. You know, nice, quick, fun, readable. I think that would be a really good way to do it. But yeah, of course, I still think that they should leave the really important stuff to the dungeons, like, well, dungeons and the raids. Absolutely. And then, of course, as far as the normals are concerned, I think that I would personally be okay with the immediate post-questing thing just still being in existence. So the idea of normals just being something that you can do as soon as you hit level 100, just to get the 1 or 2 basic bits of gear so we can get straight into normal dungeons. And then I think that in addition, it would be nice to have some scenarios during the leveling experience. A little 5-minute break in pace could be kind of nice, and I guess just from a personal perspective, sometimes I don't really feel like doing a full-on 20-minute long dungeon or something like that. Maybe not 20, 15, whatever. I just don't feel like doing a big formal dungeon. Sometimes it at least for me personally, and I know this is totally just a personal thing, but it would be okay just to do a quick little 5-minute bit of content to maybe get a nice leveling blue. I think that would be a totally okay thing to do in the game, and once again, it would just be more variation during the leveling experience, which should hopefully maybe just tone down quest burnout and that kind of thing. So yeah, overall, I think things are going pretty good in Warlords, and this is just this is like another one of those features that they made in Mists of Pandaria that they could really just bring to its final form within Warlords and make it work really well and slot into the game excellently. I think that with heroic and normal dungeons being rebalanced in terms of their place in the game and difficulty, well, that should just make it a lot easier to slot these scenarios into somewhere where it just makes sense. Anyway, that is it from me. What I'm going to throw to you is, what is your idea for scenarios, both in terms of the setting and the mechanics of scenarios? I'd love to know, and if the response from this video is good enough, I'll do a little reply video in which I'll take some of the highlighted comments from people, and I'll just run through people's suggestions, because honestly, the hive mind can come up with some really good stuff sometimes. Anyway, that is basically it for today's video, so yeah, if you want to check out my twitch.tv stream, my Patreon page, any of those things, the links are all in the description, and Twitter as well. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.